So you want to own a wind farm. Rows of turbines catching a resource that never runs out, a long-term power purchase agreement locking in years of predictable revenue, and a genuinely growing share of the country's electricity supply. It looks like a straightforward infrastructure business. Build the turbines, sell the electricity, collect the check. Here's the detail that should completely change how you picture this business. For most utility-scale wind farms built in the United States, the electricity itself often isn't even the primary source of financial return. It's the federal tax credits attached to the project, credits so valuable that a dedicated market of investors, mostly large banks with no interest whatsoever in wind power, has grown from around $20 billion in 2022 to roughly $50 billion by 2025, purely to buy into these projects and harvest the tax benefit for themselves. And right now, in the middle of 2026, there's a hard federal deadline bearing down on this entire structure. Under a 2025 law, wind and solar projects only keep full access to this credit if construction genuinely began by July 4, 2026, a deadline that's reshaping investment decisions across the entire industry as this video is being made. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually costs to build a wind farm, how the tax credit system quietly became more important than the power purchase agreement, the strange financing structure that lets banks with zero interest in electricity become part owners of wind projects anyway, and why the specific type of subsidy a project chooses can determine whether its turbines actually keep spinning for the long run. Owning a wind farm isn't one business, it's three, all catching the same wind. Version 1. The independent developer selling under a long-term power purchase agreement. A developer builds the project and sells its electricity to a utility or corporate buyer under a contract locking in a price for years, generating revenue tied directly to how much power the turbines actually produce. Version 2. The developer using a tax equity partnership to finance construction. Rather than funding the project entirely with its own capital or conventional debt, the developer brings in an outside financial partner specifically to monetize tax credits neither party could fully use alone, a structure that dominates how utility-scale wind actually gets built in America. Version 3. The utility-owned project. A large regulated utility builds and owns the wind farm directly, with enough of its own tax liability to use the credits itself, skipping the tax equity partnership entirely and folding the project straight into its regulated rate base. Onshore wind construction commonly runs somewhere between $1,300 and $1,700 per kilowatt of installed capacity, putting a typical utility-scale project in the $150 to $600 million range, depending on size. Offshore wind, still a smaller but rapidly growing category in the U.S., costs dramatically more, often $3,500 to $5,000 per kilowatt or higher, reflecting the genuine engineering complexity of building and maintaining turbines at sea. None of that capital typically comes from one source. A modern utility-scale wind project usually blends conventional construction debt, developer equity, and, critically, tax equity financing, all stacked together to fund a single facility before a single turbine has generated a watt of electricity. Here's where the picture gets genuinely different from a typical infrastructure asset. Wind farms sell electricity, commonly somewhere in the $20 to $40 per megawatt-hour range, under a long-term power purchase agreement, at a capacity factor, the share of maximum possible output a turbine actually achieves, running 35 to 45% onshore and meaningfully higher offshore. That revenue stream is real, and it's the part of the business most people picture. But the federal production tax credit, worth roughly 3 cents per kilowatt-hour of actual electricity generated for the first 10 years a wind project operates, can be worth more to the project's economics than the power sale itself, especially in years when wholesale electricity prices are soft. For a large project, that credit can add up to tens of millions of dollars over a decade, money that flows not from a utility buying power, but from the federal government, indirectly through the tax code. Now for the mechanism that explains who's actually funding a huge share of American wind power, and it's probably not who you'd guess. Most wind developers don't have enough of their own federal tax liability to actually use the tax credits their projects generate. So they partner with large financial institutions, typically big banks, in a structure called tax equity, where the bank contributes real construction capital to the project, specifically in exchange for the tax credits and accelerated depreciation benefits the project produces, benefits the bank can then apply directly against its own tax bill. This market has grown explosively. Industry estimates put total tax equity demand at around $20 billion in 2022, climbing to roughly $50 billion by 2025, driven substantially by more generous credit terms passed in 2022. These investors typically have no operational interest in the wind farm itself. They're not there for the electricity. They're there because $1 of tax credit is worth $1 off their own tax bill, often a more attractive, more predictable return than almost any other place they could deploy that same capital. Developers get access to project capital they couldn't otherwise raise. Banks get a reliable tax offset. The actual electricity generated is almost a byproduct of the transaction that makes the financing work in the first place. Here's a detail that reveals something genuinely important about how subsidy design shapes real-world behavior. Developers generally get to choose between two credit structures: the production tax credit, paid out over 10 years based on how much electricity a project actually generates, or the investment tax credit, a lump sum worth 30% of the project's capital cost, claimed almost entirely in the first year, regardless of how the turbines perform afterward. Research on completed wind projects found that facilities financed through the upfront, capital-based investment tax credit generated roughly 10% less electricity over time than otherwise comparable projects financed through the production-based credit, and researchers traced roughly two-thirds of that gap to reduced equipment availability, a direct consequence of lighter maintenance spending. It's a genuinely logical outcome once you see the incentive clearly. A production tax credit keeps an owner financially motivated to maximize output for a full decade because every additional kilowatt-hour generated is worth real money. An investment tax credit pays out its full value in year one, whether the turbines run at 90% availability or 70%, quietly weakening the financial reason to keep maintenance spending as disciplined as it should be. And this entire structure is currently facing a genuine, dramatic deadline. Under a 2025 federal reconciliation law, Congress specifically restricted eligibility for the newer version of this credit for wind and solar projects, while leaving other zero-emission sources largely untouched. To fully qualify going forward, a wind or solar project generally needs to have begun construction by July 4, 2026, or be placed into commercial service by the end of 2027. That deadline sits right in the middle of when this video is being made, and it's driving a genuine rush across the industry, developers racing to formally begin construction before the cutoff, specifically to lock in a full decade of production tax credit eligibility under the older, more favorable framework before the newer restrictions fully take hold. Scenario 1. A developer structures a tax equity partnership with an experienced financial institution well ahead of the July 2026 deadline, deliberately choosing the production-based tax credit over the simpler upfront investment credit, specifically to keep long-term financial incentives aligned with actual electricity output. The project generates steady power purchase agreement revenue and a full decade of production tax credits tied directly to real generation, and because everyone involved is financially motivated by output rather than a one-time payout, the turbines are well maintained and perform close to their rated capacity factor for years. Scenario 2. A developer rushes to formally begin construction just ahead of the deadline. structuring a hastily arranged tax equity deal around the simpler, faster-paying investment tax credit to lock in capital quickly. Upfront credit gets captured in year one exactly as planned. But with the tax benefit already realized, regardless of future performance, maintenance spending quietly lags in the years that follow, availability slips, and the project underperforms its projected capacity factor, generating meaningfully less power purchase agreement revenue than the original financial model assumed, a gap the one-time tax credit never fully offsets. So the next time someone describes owning a wind farm as a business built on selling electricity from a resource that's free and inexhaustible, the turbines and the wind really are the visible part of the story. But underneath the power purchase agreement sits a tax credit market worth tens of billions of dollars, funded largely by banks with no interest in electricity at all, structured in a way that can either keep every turbine spinning at full output for a decade, or quietly stop mattering the moment the credit gets claimed. The wind was never really the product. The tax credit structure behind it, who's actually financing the project, and whether that structure keeps everyone rowing in the same direction toward actual output, that's the real economics of owning a wind farm.